Welcome to the Requiem Metal Podcast. We just heard The Time of the Beasts
from Neurosis. Enemy of the State.
Enemy of the State.
Oh my god.
Yeah, how many times is that going to happen?
I've said that. I've done that like 10 times today.
Yeah.
And this is the album, of course, I was pushing for.
Enemy of the Sun. Yes.
And, well, I'm Mark.
And I'm Jason.
How's it going?
Good.
So we figure if we're off to this is Wacky Wednesday episode here. Yes. Everything's opposite. No, what's going on with Neurosis is that, we kind of talked about, I kind of brought this up to Mark, that this is a band that's tough to approach in terms of like how do we want to tackle a band like Neurosis that has such a fairly epic discography. And,
well, you can't really, I think, accurately represent them in one episode by just covering one album, because they go across the map. And plus, even in like interviews and stuff, they always mention that basically each record is meant to be, it's a movement, it's a series of things. They're not a single band by any stretch of the imagination.
No. So if you go and go back to their first 2 or 3 records, you're not going to hear the stuff that you're hearing today in any kind of way. There's elements that are there.
Some of it's just vocally, but even that is pale shadows of what they eventually become.
Well, because Neurosis started off as a hardcore band out of the San Francisco scene,
Oakland to be precise.
Oakland, yes, I'm
just
sorry.
Across the bay.
Yeah. And they kind of added these sort of sludgy elements, a la Black Flag, the Melvins, Flipper, all these kind of sludgecore bands that were adding kind of Sabbath riffs into the midst of hardcore, and then they kind of naturally evolved into what you just heard there, which we'll get into, the kind of the nitty gritty of what Enemy of the Sun is all about and why we picked this and stuff. But I guess our approach with Neurosis was that we decided we were just gonna, every so often kind of just pull a Neurosis record off the shelf that resonated with us. Not every single one of them, but kind of vignettes of Neurosis, if you will. Because first of all, as Mark mentioned, it'd be tough to do justice to Neurosis on one show if we like picked a song from each album or something like that. Would be
I don't even
pointless.
think we could time-wise.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the other problem is obviously the song link, and so focusing on one record allows you to get into the nitty-gritty of what that record's kind of all about. And Neurosis can be an emotionally draining band in a way, in that
it's oppressive.
You wouldn't want to listen to successive 2 or 3 part episodes in a row, in the way that you could say with Judas Priest or something like that. It's all fun. It's all like, very, I don't want to say throwaway, but there's not anything really oppressive about,
Well, I think almost all their records are kind of cathartic of some emotional experience. I mean, that's kind of what they've stated a lot, is that they want, if anything, their music's emotional. It's an outlet for them to get this stuff out. And by using, they're one of the earlier bands outside of we had Floyd and all those kind of using visuals, but even early on they really started incorporating visuals into their performance and tried to make it this whole kind of like sensory experience.
Well, and one thing, I don't want to talk too much about it, but one thing on A Sun That Never Sets, I'm so worried that I'm going to get Neurosis album titles wrong at this point, but one thing is that you can purchase is the DVD, and if you haven't heard that record, or you consider yourself, I guess, a beginning Neurosis fan, get the DVD so you can watch the visuals as you're listening to the record. I mean, it's
pretty awesome. I haven't watched it in a couple years, but I remember sitting down and having a couple drinks and just kind of cranking that up, and it's just a really good, it's not like it's a good video backdrop. It's almost kind of indicative of what they would project behind them.
Yeah.
And I think they actually did project a lot of this stuff. I saw them Contaminated Festival in like, Jesus, when was that? Whenever Sun That Never Sets came out.
2001?
2001, 2002 or something, I think, is when I saw him. But a great performance, but it's not one of those bands that you like Maiden, where you're like cheering. Mm-hmm. It's an experience. You just sit there and kind of absorb it.
And Neurosis is definitely, it's one of those bands, I don't know where you sat with them when you were younger, but when I was in high school and Through Silver and Blood came out, 96, like the end of my sophomore year, beginning of junior year, kind of in that realm. They weren't immediate to me. Like,
Not at all.
I didn't really know what to do with them, and so I kind of ignored them. I mean, I knew they were there, and I probably had listened to them a little bit, and I thought, they're heavy, they're cool, but it just took too long to get into or something like that. You know, it was like it required too much of my attention.
And I think that's kind of the whole point of their records. It's like something you have to digest, and you walk away with it like feeling like you've accomplished something, not just, you know, having it kind of wash over you. But 96 was, I worked at Relapse for a while when the record came out, and that was the first. I'd heard some of the previous stuff, but it didn't really, you know, grab me at the time. And I think Through Silver and Blood was the first time where they kind of broke their formula as far as like Locust Star was actually almost like a single. They did have a single for it, and they had a video, and I think that was kind of like their, I don't know if it was an attempt to make any kind of like, because it's definitely not a super accessible record, but opening up it a little bit more so people can kind of get into it. And that was the first one I penetrated and really got into. Yeah. Because we're like with a lot of their stuff, it's all about, you know, repetition, and it's definitely not about the hooks, because it's almost the way they build songs. It's the anticipation of the hook that never comes. Yeah, kind of thing. Except for Locust Star has a great like 3-chord breakdown in it, but it's not as like explosive as it could be. They're always kind of like they have that weird expectation in their songs.
Well, the one thing I remember about Locust Star is going back and listening to it is it's funny because the band that got me back into Neurosis was the Mosquito Control EP from ISIS back in 98 or 99. When I got that made me go back and listen to Neurosis again. Yeah. And then what I heard in Locust Star was essentially the origins of the ISIS sound, which is ISIS is taking what Neurosis is doing. It's Pelican and all those bands to some extent.
Cult of Luna. I mean, there's billions of them.
But ISIS does it really well in that they throw the hook in. You know, they can do the hook part. You know, they're all about the catharsis and the building up and stuff, but they actually like give you the hook sometimes. You know?
I think Neurosis they're more heady.
Well, it's almost meditative. You know, it's almost like tantric or something.
And like ISIS have kind of, you know, morphed into whatever they become now, which I don't necessarily know how to describe it. But what they first started out as, it was like Neurosis, but all muted palm, and it was like really repetitive, but also like really kind of weirdly catchy, but really simple too. Yeah. And so we can thank Neurosis for spawning all these good bands, but also
the Neurosis genre.
A lot of the turds that came with them. But I won't hold that against them.
I guess there's worse copycats. It could be like, you know, I mean, nu metal was like something like, you know, that was just awful and dominated in the late 90s. But I guess in the early 2000s, the Neurosis thing, like I could get into it a little bit. You know, like most of it, like even a bad Neurosis ISIS clone is still going to be like, you know, somewhat listenable, if not boring.
Here's one of my great observations. I think Neurosis is kind of like the Black Sabbath of the 90s, just purely on how many, as far as like the influence, and then like the new kind of like level of like sonic eeriness, you know, spawning that whole era of these other bands as well, because they're almost like thought upon as that, because there's nothing like this at the time when it came out.
Could we go so far as to say if you took Black Sabbath and merged them with Velvet Underground in the late 60s, early 70s, you get like kind of the same thing? Because Velvet Underground, with what John Cale was doing with this sort of like disharmonic stuff on the cello and the violins and stuff, like the Tony Conrad kind of, you know, like repetitious stuff, mixed with the sort of doom bass undertone and sludginess that you get with Sabbath,
totally,
you know? Totally. But yeah, that's a good way of putting it in terms of the spawning that they did. You know, and now I guess turning to why Enemy of the Sun. Well, actually, before I do that, let's for those of you who don't know, let's go through the lineup really quick. We've got on bass and vocals Dave Edwardson, Scott Kelly on guitar, vocals, and even does a little bit of percussion. Steve Von Till is the other guitarist and vocalist and also percussionist. The main drummer / percussionist is Jason Roeder. And then at this point, the guy doing the samples and keyboards was Simon McElroy, but he'll be the only guy that will eventually be replaced. And I think he's replaced on Through Silver and Blood, if I'm not mistaken. The new guy comes in.
Yep, I forget his name, but
I don't have
he's been on, you know, since now.
Yep. And he's a crucial element as well, because the sort of visual part of Neurosis is pretty important in the live show. You know, and then you've got a whole bunch of guest musicians. And getting back to, we'll eventually get back to Time of the Beast in a moment, and they had tons of guest musicians, a violinist and celloist and different people. But Enemy of the Sun, you know, we originally I kind of flirted with the idea of possibly doing Souls at Zero and Enemy of the Sun as a co-episode, maybe doing like 2 albums together as one. But Souls at Zero stands on its own in its own unique way. Although it's not as bombastic, it's not as fully realized as what Enemy of the Sun was.
This is kind of, I think,
pretty good record.
Yeah, like the early seeds of what would become what we know as Neurosis today.
I mean, I think this is their breakout record. You know, I think a lot of people see this as like, you know, this is what leads them to Through Silver and Blood. You know, it's not. The logical progression had to come through this record in a way. You know, they started off with Pain of Mind and The Word is Law, which are both sludgy hardcore records that have some dissonant elements to them. And then Souls at Zero, which they put out on all 3 of those records I mentioned were all on Alternative Tentacles, I do believe.
Jello Biafra's label.
Jello Biafra, yeah, out of San Francisco. And you know, eventually, like, they kind of, you know, merge a lot of their stuff onto Neurot Records, and that's their kind of own record label that Neurosis has. And you can get a lot of these records on Neurot now, re-released and stuff with bonus tracks. But Souls at Zero, which I should mention, has a sweet
Wicker Man cover.
They actually made the Wicker Man. It's not from the Wicker Man movie.
Oh, really?
I was reading about it. Yeah, they actually like built a Wicker Man for the cover of it. But
that's the way to get around licensing rights.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, but that's kind of like lays the seeds, and then Enemy of the Sun really kind of takes everything and makes it real. You can hear it in the song we just heard, Time of the Beast, very much like a funeral march. You know, it's got the violin from Chris Force from Amber Asylum.
I mean, it's almost a Black Sabbath riff.
Yeah. And the horns, and the way the horns and the violins interplay in a way gives it, like a Black Sabbath meets like high art kind of like, march kind of thing to it. And what you hear is you hear a lot of the percussive elements, and this record in particular is maybe the most percussion oriented Neurosis record that they've ever done. And they do well,
it kind of culminates in the closing track
with Cleanse, which is a perfect title. But one of the other things you start to hear in this song near the end is the first indication I wrote down of a decaying song style. And this is something that I think Neurosis does really well, is that they allow some of their songs to actually decay as they're sort of playing out. Mm-hmm. And they'll do this like really, really well in like
Sun That Never Sets.
Sun That Never Sets, and then the record right after that, which it's got a silver cover.
Given to the Rising?
No, that's the one in between. That's the latest one.
That's not State of Grace. Times of Grace.
No, Times of Grace was before it. We're going to sit here and guess the whole time. And, of course, it's the one we're not guessing. I could run over to the CD rack and grab it. But those records with Steve Albini producing did a lot of decaying song structure stuff where the songs would kind of like fall apart within. And Mark mentioned earlier this catharsis that you get from listening to a Neurosis record. And you kind of hear it in this song because it's very sad. It's very slow moving, like we said, kind of funeral procession like. So kind of a good one to start off with. It's not the most energetic of songs on the record, but the reason I chose this one is because you can hear a lot of the experimental stuff, and the rest of the songs kind of almost need to fit together the way we play them, and so I didn't want to separate this song or another song away from its kind of partner self in a way. Billy Anderson does the production. He's kind of gone on to be pretty famous, doing lots and lots of production
Brutal
stuff.
Truth, Cathedral, I mean, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, and he's also in Connate, correct? I think. I think he's in that with Stephen O'Malley. I think he's so. The other guy. So, and Connate's a good band that kind of spawned off of Neurosis too in their own weird way. They took like the most disparaging funeral-esque elements of Neurosis and kind of did their own thing with it. But so that's why we chose Enemy of the Sun. Yeah, took a long ways to get there, but I think we maybe tried to explain ourselves, and I think a lot of people feel the same way about this. It was put out in 1992, and so it's just at the beginning of the sort of 90s. I mean, it's right at the same time that the grunge thing is kind of breaking out, so they're kind of off to the races at 93. 93?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Most of it was recorded in 91, so it's kind of odd that it took that long to put out.
Jello's got to raise money somehow.
Yeah, it could be. The cover's very cool. It's very, I mean, from a, what's your...
I mean, it's almost, it reminds me of, it looks like it's some kind of statue. It almost looks like one of the Chinese stone soldiers that are in
the terracotta soldiers.
Yeah, almost like that, but then almost like as if you're getting hit by a nuclear explosion, starting to decay.
Yeah. It almost looks like kind of the ashes burnt into like the wall after like the Hiroshima or something weird like that. So it's definitely got a visual element to it. So, but we're gonna go back to the beginning of the record now with a pair of tunes that are epic, both very long. That's kind of one of Neurosis's kind of trademarks. But we've got Lost and Raze the Stray, and Lost opens up the record with a sample from a movie called The Sheltering Sky, and you'll kind of hear some samples of it. Doomy, sludgy. It's very foreboding. It takes a while to build. That's kind of the Neurosis thing. You hear this sort of hypnotic repetition mixed with kind of hissing feedback kind of in it. Very Melvins-esque. That was something you pointed out right away. And then, it builds and builds and builds. And then, of course, it goes into the sort of mammoth riff, and you kind of hear some of, usually it's Von Till and Kelly that are doing the screams. And one of the things that's interesting about the way that these guys work together is Von Till or Kelly, and they kind of reverse the order, but one will like finish the other sentence with like a higher pitched scream on top of the word that he's like ending a chorus with or something.
Yeah.
So one guy will be like, da, 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 ah! Like it's really weird. I don't.
It's almost a hardcore aesthetic though.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's like slowed down.
Yeah, it's like exactly
like the gang vocal kind of thing.
Yep, exactly. And this one in particular, you hear a couple times on this record. Dave Edwardson, the bass player, he does a deep kind of guttural growl, and you can hear it a couple times in this song. It's kind of cool.
Well, between the three guys, I mean, there's a really like pretty full vocal, range there.
Sure, it's almost like the anti-Beach Boys, but like, but in a way, it's and that's a West Coast thing too. Sort of harmonizing. The Byrds did it,
harmonizing
the Beach
but
Boys
screaming.
Did it. So they're kind of taking that West Coast aesthetic and kind of running with it. So, and it's kind of neat around the 8-minute mark that they kind of bring out some of their hardcore roots, kind of come back out with a cool bass breakdown, hardcore riff for a moment. So, and then this will sort of go into Raze the Stray, which might be my favorite song on the record. It's kind of hard to say. Lots of really neat vocal interplay going on between the two guys in this song, as well as the sort of like that opening, like haunting female vocal line that
was that the gal from Amber Asylum?
Well, no, it's not even in English. I don't even know what language it's in.
Oh, it could be. It's probably a sample.
Yeah, it's a sample of some sort. Yeah, it's really neat. And then you get some cool piano lines that are sort of buried within. You do get a lot of Amber Asylum like feel on this song. And they're a band that the more I listen to Neurosis, it makes me think like, man, I need to pull out my Amber Asylum records sometime. But then it builds and builds and builds into probably my favorite riff on the record. It's kind of got a nice groovy kind of dissonance to it.
The Godflesh riff?
Yeah.
It sounds like something off Street Cleaner.
Yeah, it's totally cool. So, and Godflesh is definitely a band that I'm sure had a major influence on Neurosis, as well as the Melvins and the Black Flags and stuff. Yeah, I'm sure they influenced Godflesh as well. So, and then we'll come back and talk about some things. So enjoy Lost and Raze the Stray. So turn off the lights and get into Hypnotic Zone.
How many more times will you remember a certain afternoon of your childhood? Some afternoon that's so deeply a part of your being that you can't even conceive your life without it. Perhaps 4 or 5 times more. Perhaps not even that. How many more times will you watch the full moon rise? Perhaps 20. And yet it all seems limitless. Are you lost?
But
Hey, you still with us?
Whoa, Hypnotized from Raze the Stray and Lost.
Evolution through pain.
Yeah, that's
What a good way to describe their music.
yeah, we
Devastation
evolution through pain,
and spirituality.
I could hear all those elements in that.
Those are
last
very
two
apt
songs.
descriptors that I, kind of sum up their sound perfectly.
One thing I wanted to mention too is, you were talking about some of the bands that influenced them. Mm-hmm. You mentioned Pink Floyd when we were listening to those tunes. Sabbath, Black Flag, Melvins. Another band I hear, because I think of their roots in both doom and in punk, is I hear a lot of, especially in the last song, a lot of Saint Vitus type riffs as well.
Could be, yeah.
So, and I mean, even though they're opposite coasts, I'm sure because they're an SST, and touring with Black Flag, that they had an influence on Neurosis. Seeing those guys, I'm sure, because they were all into the punk scene. But yeah. So
although at that time SST was kind of considered by a lot of the hardcore punks because of the way I think Greg Ginn split it up, or there's some legal issue to the whole thing.
Was there? Yeah.
Watch American Hardcore, great documentary.
That's true. I've heard stuff like that. So, well, if you weren't hypnotized before, we've got two hypnotic sets before you.
Yeah, prepare for some devastation.
Yeah, Lost and Raze the Stray are probably the two of the more, I guess, like dynamic songs in terms of like actually following through with a mammoth riff instead of just pure like catharsis. We're gonna start off with a nice little intro piece. It's only 1.5 minutes long, one of the shorter pieces you'll ever hear on a Neurosis record. It's called "Burning Flesh" and "Year of Pig." And it's about Vietnam in 1963, in June of 63, when Thich Quang Duc, Buddhist monk, was protesting the kind of Catholic regime of Diem and kind of all the anti-Buddhist policies that were going on in Vietnam at the time. And of course, American soldiers were fluttering about. We hadn't officially kind of declared war yet, so we weren't like really doing a lot. But he went and did a self-immolation in the streets of Saigon.
It's probably one of the most, well-known photographs of the 20th century, really.
Yeah. It was the person that's doing the talking, I do believe, I'm not going to say this 100%, is David Halberstein from the New York Times. I know he was an eyewitness there, and he was the guy who voiced it back for, to the American news public, like on CBS News and different things. But, it's an English-speaking voice, or an American accented English-speaking voice, so I'm just making that assumption. I don't know.
Now, is it still self-immolation even if somebody else douses you with gasoline?
That's a good point.
Semantics,
because other monks did come out and help the guy, light himself up. Supposedly, he didn't scream at all when the whole thing was happening and stuff. So,
but you can put yourself in some pretty deep
meditative states. If you listen to enough Neurosis records, you too will be there as well. But what was famous too about this was the photograph was on Kennedy's desk the next day, and Kennedy was pretty freaked out about what it was going to play out in the media and stuff. And a lot of historians believe this is when Kennedy kind of like turned the other direction on Vietnam. And some conspiracy theorists,
that's when he was
supposed that one of the reasons he was taken out, possibly by the government, is because he was going to not put us into Vietnam further, but kind of take us out of Vietnam. Who knows? As a history teacher, I can only shrug my shoulders and go, who knows?
Well, I guess we didn't have the war machine wasn't quite as large as far as all the tentacles from all like private business and the private sector.
Yeah,
like Iraq now would be Iraq, Afghanistan. You start pulling people out of there now, then people are going to be getting crummy checks, and they're going to get pissed, and no money's going to filter back through. And
there's
a vicious cycle.
A lot of stuff. Yeah, the military-industrial complex kind of started in the late 50s. Actually, ironically, the guy who was president before Kennedy, on his way out, Eisenhower, warned a famous speech, basically warned not to allow the military-industrial complex to continue to grow, because he saw it. The guy who was in charge of the entire military command of World War II was freaked out by it, and that should tell you everything you need to know about it. So, but anyways, I thought it was cool to hear this tune as it goes into a two-piece called Cold Ascending and Lexicon, which really kind of fit together. And Cold Ascending is very percussive, very tribal. I kind of sort of said it's savage and primal and chaotic and all those kind of things, and as is Lexicon, but Lexicon's much more experimental. It's definitely the noisiest song on the whole record.
Lexicon, I mean, it's got like this kind of like solid core of the bass and drums are it's fairly consistent. But then the guitars, it's almost like on the verge of collapse constantly.
Yeah.
And the vocals coming in. And
Yep. Yeah, and it's really weird. One of the things because I listened to the song a couple times today, and if you really pay attention to it, it actually has some really crazy bass lines in it.
Yeah,
it's like kind of bubbling under.
It's kind of like a Melvin's sounding bass line, really.
Yeah, it's really cool. So I mean, it's a neat tune. Unfortunately, one of the songs we are skipping, which both Mark and I like, is the title track "Enemy of the Sun," just because this record in general is just too long. It's a Neurosis record, so we had to cast aside one tune, but we figure there's an added benefit for you to go out and purchase this record, because you will get to hear the title track "Enemy of the Sun."
But for those people that are completists and they want the full versions of the songs, I think did it come out in 2000 when Neurot reissued it?
I'm not for sure. When that came out. Okay. 2002.
Yeah, because Cleanse and Cold Ascending are both abridged versions on these.
Yeah. My version is a minute shorter of Cold Ascending, which is weird.
I've got like another 11 minutes or something on Cleanse on the Alternative Tentacles version.
But my Neurot version has a demo of
demo schmemo.
Talkin' Hans from Enemy of the Sun, and it has Cleanse Part 2. A live track at the end. It's Cleanse live.
I think Cleanse, cool. The 26-minute version of Cleanse I have is long enough. It's
probably long enough. Just enough cleansing for the spirit and the body. But so these are kind of two of the more like right in your face kind of tunes on the record. After you get this kind of quiet, eerie, like intro. I mean, the fact that they use this Vietnam piece. It just makes so much sense that I can't even explain it. If you're familiar with Neurosis,
they don't really later on don't use as much
samplings or movie things.
They use samples and stuff, but it's kind of buried and mixed and made their own. And not often do you actually hear dialogue that's clearly audible.
Yeah, it's kind of neat. It's eerie though, and obviously that's what they're going for. But it's kind of the calm before the storm. Like that this song is leading you towards. The heart of the album, which is going to be even, like more murky than anything. The thing about this record compared to, I guess, other Neurosis records is not as immediate.
It's not.
I had to take a couple times before I really got into this record. So
I don't think it's a good first Neurosis record either.
Yeah,
I think if you go through Silver and
Blood's probably the first.
Sun That Never Sets, then go backwards and start cherry picking.
So we totally screwed you guys over out there.
No, we're trying to be like Neurosis and make it a difficult experience to get into this thing.
If it's not difficult, it's not worth getting into. On some level. If it's too easy, then the art itself isn't challenging you enough. So
what I found is most records I don't immediately. It's good to have different, I think, types of music you listen to for sure, but the stuff that takes a while to actually penetrate, I think, is much more rewarding than, something like Bubblegum Pop that it's just background.
Easily throw away. Yeah. That's for sure. And this is definitely not Bubblegum Pop. So lose yourself in a trio of tunes here. Shorter, I guess. So that's nice on some level. We've got Burning Flesh and Year of Pig, Cold Ascending, and Lexicon, and then we'll come back and cleanse your soul and spirit. So
the most dramatic was one day in Saigon when a Buddhist parade started off with a sort of a hypnotic chant. The yellow robe priests marching along, and then there stepped forward a very frail old man in his 70s who turned out to be this priest, Quan Duc, and he assumed the lotus posture. And another priest stepped forward and poured gasoline. And then suddenly, a towering flame. The priests and the nuns in the audience moaned and prostrated themselves toward this burning figure, and he sat there unflinching. The smell of gasoline and burning flesh in the air for 10 minutes. People thought they saw the face of Buddha in the clouds that night.
you add this to your lexicon. It's Cold Ascending and Burning Flesh in Year of Pig.
Wow. That's
clever, wasn't it?
That's a clever pun. So, if you're not uncomfortable after Lexicon, then
prepare to be purged and cleansed.
Exactly. And the tune that Mark and I have been alluding to a couple times throughout the show is aptly titled Cleanse. And we're going to play you about a 12-minute snippet, maybe longer, depending on how long this talk set goes. We might actually be able to get the whole thing in. But
it's very repetitive. It doesn't necessarily... I can see why they would have cut it down a little bit on the abridged version, but still, it's kind of... It's there for effect. It just builds and builds and builds and builds.
And that's something that Neurosis is really good at doing. You know, I think Tool does this on Latrellis very well.
Yeah.
And some rock bands have been able to kind of do this stuff. You know, like some of the Eno stuff, or, you know, we mentioned, you know, Beefheart or some of these, offbeat bands. Even Sister Ray from Velvet Underground. Yeah. You know, it's like the same riff for 17 minutes. You know, it's kind of cathartic in that sort of sense. Well, what's cool about this is you get 9 percussionists on board. You know, so not just Jason Roeder, but you know, Scott Kelly's playing drums, Von Till's playing drums, Edmondson's
it's like hand drums, kits, anything to get your hands on.
Yeah. And it's got a very like mystical nature to it, because then you hear the didgeridoo, which is an Aboriginal instrument from Australia, kind of coming in, and then somewhere in the 6 or 7 minute mark, you start to hear Von Till kind of start to make noises. You know, I don't know if there's actually lyrics or anything of the sorts, but he's using his voice as an instrument, you know, and it goes quiet, soft. It's a really neat kind of piece.
Well, and if you just describe this to me without having any kind of context of what the band is, oh wow, they got 12 drummers and a didgeridoo. It sounds like some shit that'd be at a Bonnaroo festival, but it's oppressive.
This is Neurosis. Yeah, yes. This is Neurosis doing world music. You know, so it's not they're not gonna pussy out on you here. So. But yeah, so you know, this was fun to do our first little vignette of Neurosis, a band that is near and dear to a lot of people. It definitely has a cult following, you know, very rabid fan base. They don't play live very often, so that's actually they're playing at Metal Fest, aren't they? Isn't that what I heard?
Possibly.
Yeah, I've heard that rumor that they're actually going to be
that'd be awesome
performing, you know, because they don't get around very much, you know. I know they play a couple festivals here and there. They always play the All Tomorrow.
They play West Coast occasionally, but yeah, they never hit the Midwest. Yeah. It's very rare to see them through there.
And I kicked myself because I could have gone and seen them back on the Through Silver and Blood tour. Chris invited me to go, or he was like, "Hey, I got tickets," and I was like, "It's all right. I'm not really into those guys." But yeah, live and learn, right?
Yeah.
Cleanse my spirit. Here we go.
It'll be even better.
But yeah, so let us know what you thought. Maybe this was your first exposure to Neurosis. Let us know. You know, maybe you got to listen to this episode a couple times to really, you know, kind of figure out.
You can always skip through the talk sets if you don't want to hear us talk twice.
Yeah.
There might not be as much to cull from those things as much as the music.
I know the stuff we talk about is so like dramatically important all the time, you know, so we wouldn't want you to miss that. So maybe twice through. But
I've even heard from people that they'll be listening to it at work and they don't hear some of the conversation, that they get pissed and they have to rewind.
They got to rewind
because every bit of the talk set's so valuable to them.
It is valuable.
It's a buddy of mine, so I'm gonna. I don't know if everybody has that same kind of feeling.
Well, I hope that we offer some kind of value whatsoever. You know, obviously we've been doing it for 102 episodes, so maybe someone out there likes what we're doing.
And we can talk our ass really well.
Yeah, exactly. But let us know what you thought. You know, shoot us an email at requiempodcast@gmail.com. Check us out on Facebook, Mark and Jason. Check out the website as well for Mark's artwork is up there, some of the metal stuff that he's done for Decibel, as well as tell us about, I think this is the first time you would have had an opportunity to talk about the magazine.
Yeah, Radio, Truly Crucial Rock and Roll, fanzine that me and my buddy Kevin Cross are putting together. 24 pages, I believe. Yep. But it's very illustration / kind of like essay heavy. Mm-hmm. And
there's a Left-Hand Path thing on there. It's really neat.
Yeah, there's Dead Kennedys. There's kind of like our entry point. And it's not necessarily biographical, but it's kind of showing like where these two. It's basically the whole kind of edict for the magazine is that punks and metal guys are very similar beasts. And why did it take so long to get together? And you know, it's basically a big circle jerk how great these two scenes are.
Circle lyrics. Yeah.
See,
And it's very apropos that we're doing a band that started off as a hardcore band and quickly went into esoteric, kind of doom metal, I guess.
beyond category.
Yeah, beyond category. They're so unique that they became their own genre, the Neurosis genre. Really,
Totally, yeah.
So, and also, the contest is still going. We've got prizes to give away. We've got a 6-month subscription from Decibel.
Copy of Precious Metal, T-shirts. We've got lots of CDs. So go to requiempodcast.com. Click on the sidebar for all the information.
Yeah.
It's as easy as sending an email.
I know. I mean, we want to give this stuff away. We don't,
Exactly.
we've got it to give away. Albert,
See, I'd be happy keeping it all myself, but we're not that kind of guys.
we want to give it to you, our fan base out there. But just let us know what you thought. Drop us a line on iTunes. We always like reading reviews and stuff like that. So
Yeah, giving us even if you don't want to write a review, but just give us a star rating. That pumps us up in the stats and gets more ears on the show.
absolutely. And mugs, T-shirts. Actually, somebody just said that they bought a T-shirt and they were going to wear it to a metal show to support us.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was a.
I noticed we sold a couple T-shirts.
Yeah, it was an email on Facebook.
Sweet.
I can't
Well,
remember.
whoever it was,
I can't remember who it was.
thank
I
you.
feel bad right now because I'm doing it on the spot. But anyways, for Neurosis, Enemy of the Sun, and Cleanse, I'm Jason.
And I'm Mark.
Enjoy.
Life